It's a surprising, for me, intervention by the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, who has said that he hopes vaccines will turn COVID into a disease we can, quote, live with like we do the flu by the end of the year. And that's as the number of COVID patients in hospitals in England will more than half over the next month. So what does Matt Hancock mean when he says we could live with COVID like the flu? Let's listen to Editor-in-Chief of The Lancet, Richard Horton, who says he doesn't think we'll be able to eradicate COVID. In other words, a zero COVID policy may not be practical in the UK.
I think that there have been two strategies that have been debated in the past 6 months. One strategy has been zero COVID, that we can suppress the virus transmission down to almost zero. And there have been many strong advocates of that, and in some parts of the world, zero COVID has been achieved. But in the United Kingdom, where we have new variants, where we've got the virus very deeply embedded in our communities, I think zero COVID is going to be a tough challenge. And the more likely outcome is that we are going to indeed live with it. We're going to have high levels of vaccination. We will try and suppress the virus as much as we can, but it will come back year after year after year, and we need a vaccination program in the long term to build up population immunity to protect us as best we can.
Well, a number of things occur to me immediately here, and one is that let's start with this. My regular listeners will know that every time I've drawn an analogy to the flu when I talk about COVID, I have felt it necessary, perhaps excessively or exceedingly so. It's a caveat, and I am not comparing COVID to the flu because of how sensitive people are to such comparisons, in particular those who are government scientists and the Health Secretary's various advisors. And yet here we are with the Health Secretary himself now making that precise analogy, which kind of draws the point out that things that people have said up until now were perhaps valid to say, and yet they were, other people jumped on them. Maybe this is the first point. It's only the first point I'm going to make. There's other points to make here before you jump on me for saying it. But, you know, maybe there's a lesson here for everybody to calm down and stop jumping on people's words. Because now you've got the Health Secretary himself saying we can live with COVID like the flu, which when people, and I know I've seen it, when people were making such analogies themselves in the past, they were jumped upon, they were pounced upon, and people were tempted to almost even cancel them. So that's the first point. I think it's a perfectly valid analogy. I'll give you an example of what I mean, by the way. Once on air, I discussed Professor Carl Hennigan's paper talking about the efficacy of masks, and he's the professor of evidence-based medicine at Oxford University. He had a view that he published in The Spectator based on an aggregate study of the efficacy of masks, which was a comparative study done, probably, I think, one of the most widest studies done on the subject. And it was a study done comparing it was a study done on the efficacy of masks with the influenza virus. And he, in his expert opinion, as the professor of evidence-based medicine at Oxford University, drew an analogy from that to COVID and wrote an article about it. And he was pilloried. And one of the reasons he was pilloried is because people were saying, well, no, it's not the flu. Well, obviously, he knows that. He's the professor of evidence-based medicine at Oxford University. Sorry, I keep repeating his title, but you get why I keep repeating his title. Because people on Facebook who are perhaps fresh graduates, fact-checked his article and put a big fat false on it, and the reason they gave COVID is not the flu. Do you think the professor of evidence-based medicine at Oxford University doesn't know that? What do you think he was saying? Well, probably similar to what Matt Hancock is trying to say here. So just as I made excuses for Carl Hennigan, I'm going to make excuses for Matt Hancock and say, no, he's not saying COVID is the flu. He's clearly making a deeper point. So can we all please calm down and start approaching conversations with the principle of charity? That somebody isn't always intending the worst common denominator or spin that you put on their words. Honestly, I'm so tired, up to my neck, with these sorts of let's wait till somebody slips up and pounce on them type of conversations. And so if it's good for Matt Hancock, it's good for the professor of evidence-based medicine at Oxford University, Carl Hennigan, who wasn't even saying COVID's like the flu. He was simply saying this is an analogy we can draw when we look at the efficacy of masks because the virus behaves as a respiratory virus in exactly the same way. So now let's go to Matt Hancock. So that's the first point. And I make that point simply as an instructive point for all of us to stop jumping down each other's throats when we say something that perhaps initially somebody else thinks doesn't sound right, so it must immediately be false. No, they may just have an interpretation that you haven't thought of yet. Have you ever wondered that? Maybe you're not the smartest person in the room, the person who's always insisting they're right. So that's the first point. Now, on the other point there about zero COVID, I'm glad Richard Horton editor-in-chief of The Lancet, has come out with that statement because, remember that, last week, I think it was, when the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, said that the goalposts keep moving for lifting lockdown. And he was right, because when we first went into lockdown, the reasons given to us were to protect the NHS. And then the goalposts shifted and shifted and shifted. Eventually, we started hearing things like zero COVID should be the policy. Well, you can't, that's a valid conversation to have, but you can't enter into an agreement, a social contract with a nation that you're taking away our civil liberties on one premise and then shift the reason halfway through. So zero COVID, if you want that debate, we can have that debate, but don't pretend that's the reason we're in lockdown, and therefore that's the reason, that's the threshold from which we can be released from lockdown, zero COVID, because that was never the reason given to us in the first place. You're only admitting that you're making it up as you go along if you start shifting the goalposts. So I'm glad that Mr. Horton has come out there, Mr. Horton, and said what he said, because zero COVID is not really practical, I think, to achieve, especially because the various variants will continue to emerge, like the flu. Flu variates every year, or mutates, as they say. So now moving to what it means, in my view, to live with COVID like the flu. I think what it would mean, I think probably what the Health Secretary intends here, is updated vaccines to keep up with the various variants as we go every year. For those that want them, and again, big fat red line, voluntary vaccines. But then let's not focus on that voluntary part of my sentence yet, because that's the next hour's debate when we come to vaccine passports, so we can have that conversation then. But I think what he means is that we can adapt the vaccine to adjust to these variants as they emerge. Meanwhile, there are also other pharmaceutical interventions that can be made outside of vaccines. 2 drugs have already been approved by Britain. Forgive my pronunciation of these terms, but they are... Why are drugs so complicatingly spelled? Zoe, can you tell me that? Like, look at this. This one is... let's try it. Dexamethasone. Right, I think I got that one right, but then the next one is almost impossible to read as it's spelled. Tocilizumab, 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 I think, right? Anyway, these are 2 drugs that Britain has approved, which is good, because outside of vaccines, you've got drugs as well. Now, there was some really fascinating news that the Jerusalem Post reported from Israel, and that was that they managed to cure a huge number of, I say huge number, a huge proportion of those that were in hospital with COVID with another drug that they were using. And my view was, why don't we learn exactly what they managed to do there and see if we can adopt that as well. That was, let me see if I can find that one for you. But it was, here it is, here we go. In the Jerusalem Post, 29 of 30 COVID patients, Tel Aviv Hospital says it cured 29 of 30 COVID-19 patients in days. If you want the reference for that article, that was February the 6th in the Jerusalem Post. 29 out of 30 moderate to severe COVID-19 patients who were administered a treatment developed by Tel Aviv's Sourasky Medical Center as part of a phase 1 trial recovered from the disease. Recovered. And were released within 3 to 5 days, the hospital said on Friday. As I say, this is from the 6th of February in the Jerusalem Post. So you can look that up for yourselves as well. So it's, I think with all these drug innovations, some people in Parliament, for example, I think it was David Davis or somebody else, but don't quote me on this one, but somebody, definitely an MP, stood up and asked about ivermectin as another drug, which I think is still being studied. But the combination, you get my drift here, the combination of pharmaceutical interventions and vaccines can pretty much address many people's concerns around COVID. And then that leaves a question mark, which is, if that's the case, what any longer is the justification for ongoing national lockdown? And I think that the powers that be are recognizing the difficulty of the narrative. If you at the same time are claiming, which is correct, by the way, that Britain is a world leading light in its vaccine program. Thank you, Kate Bigham. Credit where credit is due. And yet you can't then at the same time say, but we must stay in lockdown, if you're claiming both things at the same time. And so I think we're beginning to sense a thawing of the pro-lockdown voices as they realise that as vaccines roll out in the way they are, that the lockdown narrative becomes harder and harder to sustain, though of course it will be a gradual thawing, it won't be overnight. But I'm saying this is cause for optimism. So what it means then to live with COVID like the flu will be adapted vaccines to keep up with the variants. Perhaps when you travel, now, we've got these red list countries. For the life of me, I've been trying to work out what the basis is for designating countries as red list. I mean, the UAE's plonked in the middle of them, along with most of South America and South Africa. Now, I'm aware there's a South African variant, but the UAE, I'm not so sure why it's on the list, but it's on the list anyway. So you've got these red list countries. I think living with it like the flu will be a combination of keeping vaccines up to date with the variants, not travelling to certain countries, perhaps watching out in certain cramped spaces if there are particular peaks in particular cities or towns or areas. What I would say is, on the face of it, that statement by the Health Secretary, living with it like the flu, does seem to indicate that we won't be going back into this kind of pattern of lockdowns because we don't do that for the flu. So I'm hoping that's the case, just from the ostensible meaning of his words, because I believe, as everybody who listens to this show knows, that lockdowns have been one of the worst aspects of our response to dealing with COVID, which is real, right? But lockdowns, I believe, made the problem worse. That's my view. But from the face of what he is saying now, it does appear like, to me, to be the case that living with it like the flu would exclude the possibility of returning to a pattern of lockdowns, whereas, because we don't do that for the flu. Now, Zoe, I must say, has corrected the pronunciation of this drug. Thank you, Zoe. This one that I was calling tocilizumab is apparently tocilizumab. There we are. Tocilizumab is one of the drugs. Just simplify. Do an American spelling on these drugs, people, will you? Instead of giving us these complicated words like tocilizumab. Anyway, these are the two drugs that have been approved, and there will be more coming. So I'm saying this is cause for optimism. I think that the idea of following a zero COVID policy is rapidly losing, appeal. And I think living with it like the flu, which people, by the way, others have been arguing for a long time, is now becoming an increasingly likely possibility.